Again, the recognition. This is now the bill as amended, which I've noted looks very, very familiar to the bill that was passed last week that was ultimately vetoed by the governor.
Rob, give me 1 minute.
Senator Austin.
I was just saying that this amended bill that is before us strikes a strong resemblance to the bill that was recently passed by this chamber and ultimately vetoed by the governor. And I'm just curious if the good chairman of the Appropriations Committee would be nice enough to explain the differences between this document and that document. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Essentially, the difference, you are right, this looks similar to the bill that we had passed that the governor ultimately vetoed. But this bill segregates out the cost aspects of that last bill and the part that was vetoed, and says exactly where the monies would come from and where they would be deposited into. It's a little bit more prescriptive than the previous bill was, and that's essentially the difference. It does have a section in here that says that there are administrative costs for awarding such grants. Administrative costs would include, but not be limited to, the contract documents that would have to be developed on each one of these. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer, and it's very helpful. I was reading the governor's veto message, and it was quite clear that the number one objection that he had was the, in his view, the funds being dealt with as an appropriation that might be in conflict with our structural guardrails, for lack of a better term, that we've more or less been arguing over for the last 5 or 6 years, but I think everyone recognizes their value. He did go on to say a few other things, though. It was not just about the funding mechanism at large, which I understand is being addressed, presumably to make this a little more amenable to him. But this time, he also mentioned, for instance, that he thought that the $800,000 payment to a single organization without explanation as to why this entity is prioritized over others that provide similar services, it was another one of his reasons. And I noticed that this amended bill still includes that same funding on line T25 for Planned Parenthood in the amount of $800,000. I'm wondering if there's been any attention to address the governor's concern in his veto message. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. No.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I appreciate that answer. Although, are we concerned at all that the governor might, based on his previous decision-making, decide that he might want to veto this bill if it's passed as well? Through you.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My understanding is that is not why this bill is in front of us today. We have addressed some of the issues of concern by the governor, but not all. Having not been involved in those conversations, I don't know if he gave it up as a concern or he did not, but that would be a question for the governor. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I appreciate that answer. Yeah, and of course, I wasn't part of those conversations either. I didn't have any personal conversation with anyone developing this legislation or the previous version or with the governor, although I do have the document. I mean, I've got his words on paper expressing his concerns. And as we said, the first and foremost, most primary concern, I do believe, has been addressed. But, he listed that issue over the Planned Parenthood funding. He also said very clearly that taxpayer dollars should be allocated based on demonstrable need and measurable outcomes and not on political considerations. That was the entirety of our conversation when we had this similar debate a few days ago, was my argument that these groups that are listed in this now amended bill and that were contained, in, I think, identical fashion in the previous version, are clearly politically motivated from my point of view. He also goes on to say that, the decisions about how we're funding these folks must be done through a transparent and accountable process that includes clear criteria for funding decisions. And he also suggested that we revisit these items in the proper standard budgetary review process. And finally, that we should uphold the integrity of our state's budgeting process and spending cap. All things I'm in very much agreement with the governor on. And I'm just surprised to see us come back here and be faced with basically the same document. One of his several concerns being addressed, but not all of them. Is there any sort of arrangement? Has it been confirmed that the governor is going to support this this time through you, Madam President?
Senator Austin.
Through you, Madam President, I have not been assured one way or another on how the governor will vote or whether the governor will sign this bill or not. I read newspaper articles like everybody else, and in the newspaper articles it says that, but I've not had independent conversation with the governor. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I appreciate the answer. And I bring it up really, I maybe could have done it rhetorically, but I like having the conversation with the good chairman just to put it all out there that, we're not sure what the governor might do with this amended bill if it ends up on his desk. The whole thing is kind of remarkable to me because the two bills that we sent to the governor last week, I didn't support either of them. But, I did support portions of this bill, and I did support the other one. But there were items that I did not support. He made it very clear his objection was over the way money was being appropriated. The items I just mentioned, and also this notion of the guardrails and the spending cap. But it seems very odd to me because I think you've had the governor come out and campaign suggesting that he was going to be a fierce defender of the spending cap. And I think he's kind of backed that up in a way by vetoing these documents. But yet I think that without touching on the other bill too much, but it's a similar situation, just a larger amount of money. That bill's around $40 million. This one's around $3 million. And his argument was that, these things ought to go through the proper budgetary appropriations process for fear that they were going to circumvent the spending cap or even the revenue cap. And so based on that, I'm a little surprised that we have a couple of bills here that effectively do something completely different, which is to just circumvent the budget process entirely. And I just can't find logic to suggest that the governor could find a way to make an argument that he's being consistent if he goes ahead and supports these bills today versus the ones he just vetoed. I don't get it. And I hope the press is paying attention to this conversation, and I hope that these are questions that are asked if ultimately the governor does support these items at the end of the day. I think that's all I had to say really about the concept of the veto and where we are today. I guess the larger part of my comments really has to go with the subject matter of the policy before us. It's like Groundhog Day because we just did this, really. We just had this same exact conversation on this language that is in the bill that is before us. But I will go back to my remarks from last week, which is this is a question of priorities. I have people contacting me from all across the state, and certainly my own constituents within my district, expressing grave concerns about how they're going to pay their bills going forward. We all know that the electric rates in the state of Connecticut are off the chart. There's been this dispute over the public benefits charge that is still unresolved. The majority has failed to take any action on. There are constant issues with affordability. We watched in the governor's State of the Union address last night, there was a huge dust-up about the price of eggs once again. The fact of the matter is that people across the state are suffering. They are suffering because there is a genuine affordability crisis in the state of Connecticut. There's no question about that. I think no matter where you are and what district you're in or what town or who you're speaking with, and not just the poorest people in our communities. We're talking about people that are middle class, that have typically been able to stay above water, are now looking at things through a different lens and having more and more concern about where the money's coming from to be able to afford their bills. I'm also seeing towns all across Connecticut being forced to increase their budgets. This is going to put yet another heavy load on taxpayers via property taxation. So just looking at our environment and recognizing that we have this near crisis of affordability in our state, I can't for the life of me understand the majority's determination to spend taxpayer money on the items that are listed in this bill. And because I don't want to get into the dispute over whether I can read the items or not, again, I will just list a couple of them. The Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants, Inc., which is an organization which I documented. While they do good work, and they certainly do work with asylum seekers and refugees, they also very patently and very openly advocate for helping and assisting people that are in the country illegally. I think that this is a decision being made by the majority to point this fact out as clearly as possible to their base, to the people of Connecticut, that this is a priority for them, that we want to assist organizations that will aid in illegal immigration. I think it is, as I mentioned last week, shaking their fist at the president's agenda and the policies that he's putting forward. There's several organizations that fit into that. There's IRIS, which is Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. And if I look through this list, there's probably a few others that have to do with immigration generally. And if you dig a little deeper, you find that these organizations do engage in help, sometimes deportation defense and legal services for people that are in the country unlawfully. The other group, and I think there are 24 items on this list in total, the other group seems to be focused on the LGBTQ community, and even more specifically, having to do with the transgender community. I don't understand why it is that this is considered a priority by the majority party when I just described that you have people that are having to choose between keeping their light bill on and buy groceries. For them to understand and be told that money is being spent for these other purposes, I think is offensive to a lot of people, frankly. And it's offensive to me, which is why I'm taking the time to point it out once again on the floor of the Senate, to make sure that the people of Connecticut, and hopefully the press will report this, that this is a question of priorities. Just as much as the state budget is a question of priorities, this amended bill that is before us is an illustration of what the priorities of the various entities in this building are. And, you know, I can lump people into categories by party, but everyone's individual vote is going to be recorded on this bill. And I can tell you for absolute certain, I don't believe money needs to be spent on these things, not in these difficult times. We don't even have a budget yet. The budget is yet to be crafted. And it's, in my mind, you don't go spend money in big chunks before that ever happens. You have got to figure out what your priorities are first before you decide you want to start setting aside money for various different things. I understand an emergency situation might come up. There might be something we have to spend money on. In my view, as I pointed out last week when we had these bills before us, also by emergency certification, that this is also not an emergency. Whether or not Planned Parenthood or any of these other organizations that are on this list receive money is not an emergency. Planned Parenthood, as I pointed out, has $2.5 billion worth of assets. You can find that on their website in a matter of moments. They are not hurting for money. And we could argue about whether or not they perform valuable services for the state of Connecticut, or in some people's minds, this is an organization that, while they do some good healthcare things, in particular for women, but I know they also treat men, they also are the #1 pro-abortion organization in the country. And they are also very, very involved in issues advocacy, where they spend a lot of money promoting other issues, including illegal immigration and things like that. So I'm going to ask a question that I asked the other day, Madam President, and I'm hopeful that since a week has gone by, maybe we actually have a more conclusive answer, which is, for the items that are on this agenda, are there any restrictions about how the money can be used? And I will use Planned Parenthood as an example, although we can certainly pick out one of these others like Anchor Health, which I know advertises, along with Middlesex Hospital, that they do in fact do gender surgery. I'm curious to know whether when we send this money via this schedule, whether these organizations are going to have some sort of policy guidelines attached to that money suggesting their limitations on how it could be spent. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the adding in administrative costs of awarding such grants will, in part, include the construction of contract agreements through the state of Connecticut and these various organizations, which will hold them to accountability on how the money is spent. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the good chairman for their answer. I guess my follow-up to that would be how. Since we are not indicating in the amended bill before us any policy conditions, like normally when we pass a budget, we have an implementer, whether it's made part of the same document or it's voted on separately. You have the line item that says X amount of dollars, but then you also have policy that goes with it that says, well, that X amount of dollars is for payroll or for benefits or for an expressed purpose. Here, there is no policy that goes with these numbers. So who's determining what the policy actually is? Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In items such as this, both in implementer language or other budgetary documents that we have had throughout my tenure of doing the budget, the concept of prescribing exactly what each contractor would spend the dollars on is more broad brush than down to the nitty-gritty details. For example, when we give money to nonprofits, we say for nonprofits. We don't say exactly for salary for the lowest workers. We have done that once or twice, but that puts them at risk for not dealing with the other issues that they have to deal with. So it all depends, quite frankly. I've seen bills such as this in both the budget and here, and very much see this as standard, not as an outlier. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I don't know that I mentioned nitty-gritty details, for example, but I mean, I am looking for some guidance. I think it's easy to say that, this is somewhat standard, and I certainly don't want to disagree with my counterpart because she's far more of an expert at the budget process than I am. But the fact of the matter is that when we get a budget, it's a pretty sizable document, but so is the implementer. The implementer is another giant document that lays out how that money is to be spent. And while there may be some very, very obvious intention for how it's to be spent if you're giving money to certain nonprofit organizations, I think the danger here is that you're talking about organizations that engage in a lot of different activities. And in fact, frankly, these are very small organizations outside of Planned Parenthood. In fact, many of them are completely unknown to me. And I think that the people in this room would be very hard-pressed to tell you in either party if they have any familiarity or understanding of what each of these organizations do at all. I don't know if they consist of, more than a couple of people and their best intentions. And to me, that's a concern when we're cutting checks. And in my view, these are blank checks. When you're just giving out $62,500 to the Queer Youth Program of Connecticut without telling anyone what it's for, you're giving them a blank check to spend the money on whatever they choose. And I think that was more or less acknowledged by the good chairman. I'd love to get a response to that. Is that true? Is this a blank check to these organizations? And can, by virtue of the fact that we're just saying, line item 62,500 for Center for Children's Advocacy or Kids in Crisis or any of these other items, whether or not they can spend it on things that might, based on the title of their organization, seem like they don't fall into that category. Through you.
Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My understanding of the contract process through this, that the very title of the organization gives you an idea on on how the dollars will be spent, and within the confines of that would mean that, for example, and I was not being critiquing on nitty gritty, but just saying we don't do specific. We're not down to the specificity that some people say we are all the time, but that is not true. So we'll use Kids in Crisis, for example, is not going to be able to use the money when the contract is developed through them to fix the sinkhole in front of their building, if that was something that came up. But it would be in the confines of the programmatic needs of that particular organization. And I do not know that particular organization, having not worked with them, but that's how this would field its way through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Duff.
Thank you, Madam President. With the Senate attendees for a moment, we have...
Madam President. So I heard two things in the gentle lady's response that I found, frankly, somewhat alarming. The first one is that the title of the organization should give us an indication of what they do. So does that mean, through you, Madam President, that if I come out with an organization and I title it in a certain way, that I'm going to give, food for people in need, we're just going to assume that's what I'm doing, through you, Madam President, rather than actually giving me some sort of policy direction to say, well, gee, Rob, you can't fix the sinkhole in front of your building with the money. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Is this better?
Yes,
Better?
much.
Okay. Let's see. I didn't know you were all that interested in what I was saying. I just have to say that out loud.
Absolutely.
So I didn't mean to imply that we could have a fictional name that would come up to say that we were doing work with children or adults and we were actually working with animals, for example. That would not be allowed, but I meant that there's often a mission statement that goes with each one of these organizations, that would guide the contractual conversation that would happen as the contract is being written up. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I appreciate that answer. And I certainly do not doubt the good intentions of the gentle lady or any of the other folks that are involved in this discussion or debate. But I do think that there's something that's pretty glaringly missing here. And the idea is that I don't know, and I mean no disrespect to the organizations on this list either, but because I'm not familiar with OutCT or P-Flag Enfield or Peer Pride or City Seed, Havenly. I've never heard of these organizations before. I don't know that they're not fictional. And frankly, I just heard the good chairman say she's not familiar with the one that we had previously mentioned. So how do we know? I mean, really, that's my question more than anything overall to everything I've been asking, which is how do we know? How do we know that these are legitimate organizations, and how do we know that the money is going to be used for legitimate purposes? And again, for me in the minority, I don't even know what the legitimate purpose is. I have no idea because it doesn't say anything. I'm going on what the good chairman of the Appropriations Committee said, which is the expectation is they're going to do something in the realm of the name of their organization. That's pretty loosey-goosey to be spending a lot of taxpayer dollars, in my view. I don't like the idea of giving blank checks to people when I have people back home that have to choose whether or not they're paying their electric bill or they're paying to turn the furnace on. It's very, very scary, in my view, when you have things like this. And as I would point out once again, if you read through this list, it is overtly political. It is virtue signaling to two maybe three very, very distinct groups. We are committed to abortion, it says, according to the funding for Planned Parenthood. We are committed to gender-affirming care based on the commitment to some of the organizations on there that perform those services, as I mentioned. And we are committed to the illegal immigration movement, for lack of a better term, based on the funding for some organizations that are on this list. And I understand that these organizations aren't overtly titled illegal immigration, but when you start to investigate the mission statements and the public comments that come from these organizations, through a simple Google search, you find out that they're very, very much involved. IRIS, which is on this list, T23, getting $225,000 taxpayer dollars, they're one of the main advocates for Husky for Immigrants, which is to fund free health care for people not in the country lawfully. Final question on this topic, if you will, Madam President. Through you to my esteemed colleague, what protection do we have that these funds are not going to be used for the items that I mentioned? In the case of Planned Parenthood, how do I know the money is not going to be used for advocacy, political advocacy on other issues? How do I know that? And how do I know that Middlesex Hospital is not going to use this money for gender transitions? And how do I know that these other immigration-related entities who, like I said, publicly advertise services for illegal aliens, how do I know that this money will not be used for those purposes? What guarantee do the taxpayers have through you?
Thank you, Senator Austin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And through the contract documents, which we don't approve, generally speaking, in the legislature and the audits that happened to make sure that the organizations complied with those contract documentation. And some of the things that we don't support regularly are, for example, politics in our organizations. There are people who say that we support political organizations. Has not really been something that we allow ourselves to participate in. That is one of the examples. And so every single contract has a single audit that happens to make sure that they're in compliance with the contract documents as presented that they sign. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And again, I greatly respect my colleague, and I appreciate what she's saying. I'm just extremely disappointed that a week has gone by since we had this conversation, and the answers are the same, because the answers were frankly inadequate. You know, Planned Parenthood is an organization that does a lot of good health care things I've already acknowledged. They also are the #1 abortion provider in the country. And we have restrictions on whether or not taxpayer dollars can be used to pay for abortions. I don't know. There's certainly federal restrictions. I don't know what kind of state restrictions there are. But the fact of the matter is, I believe the people that I represent would like to know whether this money is being used for which of those things. Is the money being used to provide other types of health care, or is it strictly for abortion? Or is it going to be used for political advocacy? And what protection do we have to say that money that is directed to one thing is not used for another? I don't know that exists, and certainly not in this document. The gentlelady also mentioned that we don't give to political organizations. Well, they're a political organization in my view. They perform services, but I don't know what portion of their business model is based on performing services and how much of it is on advocacy. And I scroll down here and I look at Junta for Progressive Action. As far as I know, that is a political advocacy organization. I think that's the sum total of what they engage in. I don't know if they perform other services. So this is a very clear document in my view. This is the majority party reasserting their commitment to these topics for the benefit of their voting base. And I got no problem with that. In fact, I think it's fine. We can certainly stand here and differ on what our priorities are. But in my view, these are not the priorities we should be focused on. We should not be focusing on funding illegal immigration or gender-affirming care or abortion for that matter. What we should be doing is finding a way to allow my constituents and yours to be able to afford to pay their bills by not overburdening them with a lot of government spending on these types of things. That's just my view. And in that vein, Madam President, I'd like to offer an amendment. The LCO number is 5995. I ask that the clerk please call this amendment, and I be given leave of the chamber to summarize.
Mr. Clerk, please do call the amendment.
LCO number 5995, Senate Amendment B.
And Senator Sampson, please do summarize.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is a strike-all amendment, and essentially what it's going to do is replace the amount of funding that is being provided to these 24 organizations that are in the underlying amended bill that we're debating. And instead of funding all of these organizations focused on the topics I just mentioned, this is going to instead fund things that I believe are real priorities in the state of Connecticut. First and foremost is the elderly nutrition program through what we know as Meals on Wheels to the tune of $1,450,000. And the balance would go to the low-income heating assistance program in the amount of $1,450,000. And we do retain a $100,000 payment, which is actually an increase for Jewish Family Services of Greenwich, Inc. The total amount is the same, but rather than the list of what I consider to be politically motivated and controversial recipients, I think that we should all be able to get behind taking care of low-income heating assistance and our seniors that are in need. I move adoption, Madam President, and I'd like a roll call vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would ask my colleagues to not support this amendment, as most of this is being reserved, that is in this amendment will be reserved for discussion under the budgetary conversations that are currently ongoing. Through you, Madam President.
Senator